Henry V was born into a kingdom at war with itself, grew up under a usurper father, took an arrow in the face as a teenager, and somehow still became the warrior king that many in England regard as one of their greatest rulers. His story is not just one battle, it's the journey of a prince who turned early scars into fuel for a reign that almost united the crowns of England and France. In today's video, we're going to follow Henry V from his birth in a troubled royal family, through his brutal initiation at the Battle of Shrewsbury, where a 6-inch arrow buried itself in his face, to his transformation into a deeply pious, disciplined king. We'll see how he tightened control at home, crushed rebellions, and then launched the campaigns that led to Harfleur, the famous march across France, and his stunning victory at Agincourt. Along the way, we'll look at how he balanced faith, politics, and sheer military ruthlessness, and why, even with some very harsh decisions on his record, contemporaries on both sides of the channel still admired him as a just and upright ruler. This is not just Shakespeare's Henry with stirring speeches, it's the real man behind the legend, warrior king, devout Christian, hard and uncompromising, but also brilliant, focused, and incredibly effective in a reign that lasted less than a decade. If you enjoy this kind of deep dive into medieval lives, make sure to subscribe to Medieval Crazy History and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. And if you want the full battlefield experience after this biography, don't forget to check out our video dedicated exclusively to the Battle of Agincourt in the card at the end of this video. Let's look at the biography of Henry V of England. Henry V was born into a world where crowns could be taken by force and a prince's future depended on who won the next rebellion. Long before he became England's warrior king, he was simply Henry of Monmouth, a boy growing up in the long shadow of a dangerous family story. He was probably born on 9 August 1387 in Monmouth Castle, on the Welsh border, the eldest son of Henry Bolingbroke and Mary de Bohun. At that time, his father was a powerful noble, grandson of Edward III, but not yet king. The reigning monarch was Richard II, Henry's cousin, and the relationship between Richard and Bolingbroke was tense, to put it mildly. Bolingbroke had helped lead the Lords Appellant against Richard in the late 1380s. The king never forgot that, and for years Henry's father drifted in and out of favour. For young Henry, that meant his position at court was never entirely secure. When Henry's father was exiled in 1398 after a dispute with Thomas de Mowbray, the boy did not follow him. Instead, Richard II kept the young prince in his own household, and by most accounts treated him with kindness. Chroniclers even suggest a genuine affection between them, with Henry leaving Richard's company with a sorrowful heart when their paths finally parted. It's one of the ironies of his life. The future Henry V, hero of a new royal line, spent part of his youth as the guest, almost the adopted protege, of the king his father would later depose. In 1399, everything changed. While Richard was in Ireland, Bolingbroke returned from exile, gathered support and seized power. Richard was deposed. Bolingbroke became Henry IV, and young Henry of Monmouth was suddenly heir to the throne, created Prince of Wales, and given new titles. Overnight, he went from a prince with an uncertain future to the central figure in a new dynasty, resting on a very shaky foundation. Many nobles still saw the Lancastrian regime as illegitimate. Rebellions and plots flared across the kingdom. For the teenage Henry, this meant growing up in a court where loyalty was always being tested, and the next battle was never far away. He did not stay long in the safety of halls and chapels. As Prince of Wales, Henry was quickly drawn into real warfare. He gained early experience in the brutal campaigns against the Welsh revolt led by Owain Glyndŵr, riding with royal armies through rugged terrain and seeing firsthand how hard it was to crush a determined insurgency. More dramatically, in 1403 he joined his father against one of the most powerful families in England, the Percys of Northumberland, at the Battle of Shrewsbury. There, in fierce fighting that lasted hours, the young prince took a wound that would mark him for life. During the battle, Henry was struck in the face by an arrow that entered near his nose or cheek and drove several inches into his skull. The shaft was cut off, leaving the barbed head embedded in bone. Removing it required extraordinary surgery by the royal surgeon John Bradmore, who devised a special tool to widen the wound, grasp the arrowhead, and slowly draw it out over several days, all while trying to prevent infection. Against the odds, the young prince survived, though he likely carried a scar for the rest of his life, a reminder every time he looked in the mirror that kingship in his world was bought with real blood. By the time the wound healed, Henry was no longer just a royal teenager. He was a battle-tested commander in the making. The combination of a fragile dynasty, constant unrest, and that near-fatal injury helped shape his character. He grew up knowing that the crown his father wore could be lost if he looked weak, and that in a kingdom like his, a prince had to prove himself not only in council chambers, but in the front line of battle. As Henry moved from wounded teenager to young adult, he didn't drift into a quiet, princely life. He was pushed straight into the engine room of his father's troubled kingdom. From 1400 onward, rebellion in Wales under Owain Glyndŵr, northern unrest and his father's fragile health meant that the new Prince of Wales was expected to act less like a boy and more like a working commander and deputy king. Formally created Prince of Wales, Duke of Cornwall and Earl of Chester, after Henry IV's accession, the young Henry was quickly given real responsibilities. From October 1400, the administration of Wales was conducted in his name, and by 1403-1404, he was taking actual command in the war against Glyndŵr. He established headquarters along the marches, often around Shrewsbury, and led campaigns into North Wales, retaking castles, negotiating pardons, and putting relentless pressure on the revolt. It was a harsh training ground, long marches in difficult terrain, ambushes, and a determined Welsh resistance reinforced at times by French support. This period shaped him deeply. On the one hand, it honed his military skills and gave him a reputation as a serious, energetic commander rather than a pampered heir. On the other, the methods needed to break a long rebellion, garrisons, scorched earth, and hard justice, pushed him toward a view of kingship in which order and obedience came first. By 1408-1409, the Welsh revolt was largely broken, and Henry had played a central role in that outcome. Unlike the glamorous victories he would later win in France, this was grinding, unromantic warfare, but it taught him how to manage men, supply lines, and stubborn enemies over years, not days. As he gained military experience, Henry also became more assertive in politics. With Henry IV increasingly ill, plagued by serious health problems, and sometimes too weak to govern, Prince Henry began to demand a larger voice in royal policy and a regular place on the King's Council. For a stretch around 1410-1411, he and his allies effectively dominated the government, steering policy toward a more aggressive stance in France and a firmer line at home. This caused friction not only with his ailing father, but also with senior churchmen such as Archbishop Thomas Arundel, who disagreed with some of the prince's priorities. Later legend, especially via Shakespeare, turned this period into the story of a wild prince reformed overnight, but the reality is more political than scandalous. Henry wasn't a tavern thug, he was an ambitious heir pushing for influence while his father's grip weakened. Eventually, Henry IV reasserted control, sidelining his son from the council for a time and reminding everyone that the old king was still on the throne. Yet the experience had lasting effects. By the time Henry of Monmouth finally inherited the crown in 1413, he already knew what it meant to run armies, manage a kingdom under pressure, and navigate the delicate balance between obeying a king and preparing to be one. When Henry finally became king in 1413, many people in England were nervous. He was the son of a usurper. His father had spent years fighting rebellions, and there were questions about whether the Lancastrian dynasty would even survive. Yet from his first days as Henry V, the new king seemed determined to turn a disputed crown into something respected and stable. One of his first priorities was to present himself as a serious, devout, and lawful ruler. Chroniclers and official records show him making a point of attending religious services, listening to sermons, and showing public respect to the church, in contrast to the more turbulent image of his youth. He ordered proper reburial and honors for Richard II, the king his father had deposed, an important symbolic gesture acknowledging past wrongs and trying to calm old hatreds. He also confirmed many charters and privileges, reassuring nobles and towns that their rights would be respected under the new regime. All of this helped signal that Henry V intended to rule not just by force, but by recognized law and tradition. At the same time, he made it clear that some lines would not be crossed, especially in matters of religion and loyalty. One early test came with the Lollards, a reform-minded religious movement that criticized the wealth of the church and questioned official doctrine. A prominent Lollard noble, Sir John Oldcastle, had been a friend and companion of Henry when he was prince. As king, Henry initially tried to protect Oldcastle, urging him to submit and repent rather than face condemnation for heresy. When Oldcastle refused and eventually escaped custody, things changed. In January 1414, Oldcastle and his allies organized an uprising aimed at seizing the king and forcing sweeping religious and political changes. Henry moved quickly, surrounding the rebels at St. Giles's Fields near London and crushing the revolt. Many of those captured were executed for treason and heresy. Henry's handling of the Oldcastle revolt shows both sides of his character. Personally loyal and reluctant at first to destroy an old companion, he nevertheless chose, in the end, to side firmly with orthodoxy and royal authority when faced with open rebellion. As one study of his Lollard policy notes, his persecution of heresy followed the doctrine of the medieval church and also served a clear political purpose, eliminating a movement that could undermine both church and crown. To later eyes, this can seem harsh, but in the context of 15th century Europe, Henry's stance made him look like exactly what many subjects wanted, a king who protected the faith and kept order. Domestically, the effect of these early years was noticeable. Under Henry IV, England had been plagued by repeated uprisings and doubts about the monarchy's legitimacy. Under Henry V, internal politics grew noticeably quieter. There were still tensions. Relations with Scotland, for example, were far from perfect, but in general the kingdom was more united than it had been in decades. Henry's combination of public piety, respect for legal forms, firmness against rebels, and constructive gestures toward former enemies helped him build an image of a king who was both strong and just. By the time he began seriously turning his attention back to France, he had largely achieved what he wanted at home, a realm stable enough to follow him into a very ambitious war abroad. By the time Henry V felt secure on his throne, he was ready to look beyond England's borders. In his view, the kingdom could not simply sit at peace while a long-standing claim to the French crown lay dormant and English territories in France remained in dispute. The 100 Years' War had paused, but it had never truly ended. For Henry, reviving it was not reckless adventurism. It was a way to legitimize his dynasty, unite his subjects, and, if all went well, massively expand his realm. His claim to the French throne came through his great-grandfather Edward III, whose mother had been a French princess. Earlier English kings had already used that genealogy to justify war, but Henry V pressed it with new intensity. In 1414, he formally demanded from France nothing less than recognition of his right to the French crown. When that proved unrealistic in the short term, he scaled his demands back, first asking for the restoration of a vast block of lost Angevin territories, and then, more modestly, for the lands ceded to Edward III in the Treaty of Bretigny, along with payment of old debts, such as the unpaid ransom of King John II of France. None of these proposals led to a lasting agreement. In Henry's eyes, French delays and partial offers looked less like negotiation and more like evasion. It helped his case that France at this time was deeply divided. King Charles VI suffered from recurring bouts of mental illness, and rival factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, fought for control of the government. From across the Channel, this chaos looked like both a danger and an opportunity. A disunited France might be tempted to interfere in English affairs or support enemies like the Welsh and Scots, but it was also much more vulnerable to a determined, well-led invasion. Henry's council debated the risks, and in the spring of 1414, he called a great council to discuss war with France. The lords urged him to moderate his claims and continue negotiating, but the direction was clear. If diplomacy failed, the king meant to fight. Preparing for such a campaign was a colossal task. Henry needed ships, men, weapons, and supplies on a scale England had not seen in years. He oversaw the fitting out of a large invasion fleet, drawing not only on royal ships, but also on hired and requisitioned vessels from English ports. On land, he raised an army built around a high proportion of longbow archers, perhaps 75–80% of the force, supported by men-at-arms. Contracts, indentures with nobles and captains specified exactly how many mounted men-at-arms and archers each would bring, and for how long they would serve. The crown stockpiled arrows by the 100,000, as well as armor, siege guns and gunpowder, and organized the provision of food, drink and fodder for a campaign that was expected to last at least a year. These preparations reveal another side of Henry V's character. He was not just a charismatic leader who inspired men with speeches. He was also a meticulous planner who understood that victories begin in warehouses and shipyards, Accounts from 1415 show royal officers worrying about everything from the number of tons of ale to the shoes on the men's feet and the condition of the horses. Henry himself took a personal interest in artillery, investing in guns and powder and making sure they were ready to be used in sieges like the one he would soon conduct at Harfleur. On 11th August 1415, after long months of preparation, Henry sailed from Southampton with an army of perhaps around 12,000 men, carried by a fleet of several hundred ships. 3 days later, they landed on the Norman coast and began operations that would lead first to the grueling siege of Harfleur and eventually to the muddy fields of Agincourt. For Henry, this was more than a military expedition. It was the test of everything he had been building since 1413, a stable kingdom at his back, a disciplined army at his command, and a claim to the French crown that he now meant to enforce not just with parchments and seals, but with steel and bowstrings. Henry's grand campaign of 1415 did not begin with glory in a muddy field. It began with a slow, brutal lesson in what war really costs. His first target in France was the port of Harfleur, a strongly fortified town at the mouth of the Seine. Landing nearby in August, he set about besieging it in textbook fashion, surrounding the landward side, bringing up artillery, and bombarding the walls while sappers tried to undermine the defenses. The French defenders responded stubbornly, repairing damage and flooding the surrounding fields by opening sluices, turning the ground around the town into foul, disease-breeding marsh. The siege dragged on for more than a month, longer than Henry had planned. Inside the town, civilians and soldiers suffered from bombardment and shortage of food. Outside, the English army was devastated by disease, especially dysentery, the bloody flux. Letters and chronicles describe men from all ranks, including high-status nobles and bishops, struck down by sickness caused by polluted water and poor sanitation. Many had to be sent back to England in ships once the town finally capitulated in late September. The victory gave Henry a vital foothold in Normandy, but his army was much smaller and weaker than the force that had landed. At this point, Henry faced a choice. The safe option was to garrison Harfleur and sail home, claiming success with a significant if limited conquest. Instead, he made a more daring decision. He would march his reduced, exhausted army overland to the English stronghold of Calais, some 150 to 200 miles away, in what chroniclers and modern historians see as both a calculated risk and, in part, a deliberate provocation. He left his heavy artillery and much of his baggage at Harfleur to move faster, relying on speed and discipline to cross enemy territory. The French, naturally, were not inclined to let him stroll across their kingdom unchallenged. The march north became a test of endurance. Autumn rains turned the roads into mud, river crossings were contested or destroyed, and French forces shadowed the English column, cutting off supplies where possible. Henry's army was tired, underfed and suffering from the lingering effects of disease picked up at Harfleur, yet order was maintained. The king enforced strict discipline, punishing looting and indiscipline to keep local populations from turning entirely hostile and to preserve cohesion in his ranks. He also kept a close eye on the French, trying to avoid being trapped in a truly hopeless position while still pressing on toward Calais. Eventually, near the village of Agincourt, on 25 October 1415, the French managed to block Henry's path with a large army that significantly outnumbered the English. Henry's men took up a defensive position in a narrow, freshly ploughed field, flanked by woods. The heavy French men-at-arms, eager for a decisive victory, advanced across ground that quickly turned into a quagmire under their own weight and armor. English longbowmen poured volleys into their ranks, and when the French finally crashed into the English line, they were exhausted, packed tight, and unable to maneuver effectively in the deep mud. The result was the famous English victory, a small, tired army defeating a much larger French force, with enormous casualties on the French side. Henry himself fought in the front line, his presence and personal courage widely praised by chroniclers. But even amid the celebration, one of his decisions at Agincourt has remained controversial. At a critical point in the battle, fearing that a renewed French attack or an uprising among the many prisoners could overwhelm his depleted troops, Henry ordered a large number of captured French knights and men-at-arms to be killed. Some of his own men hesitated, not mainly out of compassion, but because prisoners represented valuable ransom income. But the order was carried out by archers under royal authority. To modern sensibilities, this seems brutal, and even some contemporaries were uncomfortable with the scale of the killing. Yet in the logic of medieval warfare, where kings were expected to prioritize victory and the survival of their armies, Henry's decision can be seen as a harsh, battlefield calculation rather than an impulsive act of cruelty. For his supporters in England, it did not tarnish his reputation. Agincourt became the defining triumph of his reign, proof that under Henry V, a united kingdom led by a determined king could defy the odds and humble one of the greatest powers in Europe. Agincourt made Henry V famous, but it did not make him King of France. To turn a spectacular battlefield victory into lasting power, he needed something much harder: years of methodical campaigning and the kind of diplomacy that could turn enemies into reluctant partners. After returning briefly to England, Henry launched a new invasion in 1417, this time aiming not for a single dramatic battle, but for the systematic conquest of Normandy. Landing near the mouth of the River Touquet, he moved inland with a well-organized army and a clear plan: take key ports and fortresses, split enemy territory, and cut off French forces from each other. Town after town fell: Caen in 1417, then Alençon, Le Mans and others, often after sieges where Henry's artillery and engineering played a central role. The climax of this Norman conquest came with the long and brutal siege of Rouen 1418-1419, whose fall effectively gave him control of the whole duchy. It was a huge psychological blow to the French. The old Norman heartland, lost by English kings 2 centuries earlier, was back under an English crown. All this military pressure took place against a backdrop of civil war within France. The Armagnac and Burgundian factions were still locked in a bitter struggle. In 1419, the murder of John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, on a bridge at Montereau pushed his successor, Philip the Good, firmly toward alliance with the English. Henry V understood that swords alone would not win him a double crown. He needed French allies as well as French conquests. His combination of victories in the field and careful diplomacy with Burgundy created a situation in which the French royal government, dominated by the sick and politically weakened Charles VI, had little choice but to negotiate on English terms. The result was the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, one of the most remarkable diplomatic triumphs of the Middle Ages. Under its terms, Henry married Catherine of Valois, the daughter of Charles VI, and was recognized as regent of France and heir to the French throne. The Dauphin Charles, the future Charles VII, was disinherited. On paper, this created a double monarchy. Henry V, already King of England, was now set to inherit France as well once his father-in-law died. For a brief moment, it looked as though the centuries-old dream of an Anglo-French crown united on one head was about to come true. This high point in Henry's career also had a more personal side. His marriage to Catherine appears by the standards of royal politics to have been reasonably warm. In 1421, she gave birth at Windsor to their only child, another Henry, the future Henry VI. But the warrior king barely saw his young family. Even after Troyes, he spent most of his time in France, consolidating territories, besieging holdouts like Meaux, and trying to turn treaty promises into solid control on the ground. The war did not end simply because a document said he would be king. Many French nobles and communities still supported the disinherited Dauphin. In the summer of 1422, while conducting the siege of Meaux, Henry fell seriously ill. Chroniclers and modern historians suggest dysentery as the most likely cause, though other diseases have been proposed. He was still in his mid-30s, at the height of his power and reputation. Yet on 31st August 1422, at the Château de Vincennes near Paris, Henry V died, never having seen England again after his final departure, and never having met his infant son. A few weeks later, Charles VI of France also died. According to the Treaty of Troyes, the crowns of England and France should now have rested together on Henry's head. But Henry was gone, and the inheritance passed instead to his baby boy. Henry V's body was taken back to England and buried in Westminster Abbey with great ceremony. His 9-year reign had been short but extraordinary. He had stabilized a troubled kingdom, won one of the most famous battles in English history, reconquered Normandy and forced a French king to name him heir. His death left a dangerous vacuum. A child, Henry VI, would now have to rule 2 kingdoms in theory, while in practice the war in France continued and French resistance regrouped around the Dauphin. For later generations in England, however, these later reversals did little to dim Henry V's personal legend. He remained the warrior king, who turned a disputed crown into a banner under which the realm could unite, a ruler whose combination of piety, discipline, and military genius became a model of what a medieval king could be. Even if the double monarchy he almost created did not survive, the story of his life, from arrow in the face to almost king of France, secured him a permanent place in the pantheon of England's greatest rulers. Henry VI's life feels almost impossible when you lay it out in order. A prince born into a usurping dynasty, nearly killed by an arrow through the face as a teenager, spends his youth crushing rebellion in Wales and arguing over policy with a sick, suspicious father. Then, in less than 10 years on the throne, he calms a kingdom, defeats a much larger French army at Agincourt, reconquers Normandy, and signs a treaty that names him heir to the crown of France. Few medieval kings ever managed so much, so fast. At the same time, he was not a spotless legend, but a very real medieval ruler, devout, disciplined, and serious, but also capable of harsh decisions that still make people uneasy today, like ordering the killing of prisoners at Agincourt or cracking down hard on religious dissent. Yet, in the context of his world, a world of usurpations, civil wars, and brutal international conflict, those choices reinforced, rather than undermined, his reputation as a king who put duty, order, and victory ahead of everything else. That is one reason why, centuries later, he is still remembered in England as a model warrior king, and why Shakespeare and modern historians alike keep returning to his story. So when we think about Henry V, we're not just looking at the hero of one famous battle, but at a young man who turned a fragile crown into something powerful enough to scare half of Europe, and then died before he could see how the story ended. Was he the ideal Christian king, a brilliant but ruthless general, or a bit of both? That's for you to decide. If you enjoyed this journey through his life, don't forget to subscribe to Medieval Crazy History and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and when you're ready to dive deeper into mud, arrows, and armor, check out our separate video dedicated entirely to the Battle of Agincourt,